Welcome again. I'm Allison Dahl, a member of the World Affairs Series Planning Committee, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Luis Citabaca was appointed by President Barack Obama to direct the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons at the Department of State. He holds the rank of Ambassador at Large and Senior Advisor to the Secretary of State. Ambassador Citabaca has worked under 3 presidential administrations to combat human trafficking and modern forms of slavery. In his current position, he heads the office dedicated to pressuring foreign governments to free persons forced to work under threat of violence for no pay beyond subsistence. Previously, he was one of the most decorated federal prosecutors in the Justice Department. He has led the investigation and prosecution of cases involving money laundering, organized crime, alien smuggling, official misconduct, hate crimes, and human trafficking. Ambassador Citabaca has been honored with the Attorney General's Distinguished Service Award for his service as lead trial counsel in the largest slavery prosecution in U.S. history, which involved the enslavement of more than 300 Vietnamese and Chinese workers in a garment factory in American Samoa. He has also received the department's highest litigation honor, the Attorney General's John Marshall Award. As many of you in the audience may know, Luis Citabaca was raised on a farm near Huxley and graduated from Ballard High School. He earned his bachelor's degree in political science from Iowa State and received his law degree from the University of Michigan Law School. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Citabaca back to Ames and his alma mater.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you to the lecture series and to the World Affairs Council for hosting tonight. For me, it's great to be back and to be here in the Memorial Union, where I certainly spent quite a bit of time both studying downstairs and then also participating and sitting in the back and watching people give these speeches. I think I might have paid attention a little differently if I'd known that I would give one eventually. Many of you in the Iowa State community not only perhaps know me, but also my family. My father, Robert Citabaca, who was in the Ag College in the Animal Science Department, and my mother, Mary Debaca, who came to be in the home economics, now I guess family and consumer sciences, and is now in the Ag College. But I think it's probably appropriate that I talk about the issue of modern slavery and slavery in the Americas tonight because of another member of our family who some of you may have studied. Many of you may be hearing about him for the first time. But it's a guy by the name of Alvaro Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who was the first of our family to come to the Americas almost 500 years ago. He's fairly well known for exploring in the southern part of the United States. But then after that, after he basically walked across America, he was posted to Argentina as the colonial governor. And one of the first things that he did when he got down there is he issued a law saying that the Spanish colonists needed to stop enslaving the Indian women and using them as concubines. His term as governor ended about 10 days later when the Spanish colonists arrested him and sent him back to Spain. In chains. So I hope that my term working on this issue for President Obama and for the American people turns out better at the end. I want to thank everyone for coming, friends, faculty, students. I've been told that some of those who've known me the longest are in the audience so that they can keep me honest, and I will try to be honest. I also want to give a pitch for John Donaghy's upcoming talk, which I think that if we think about what are the things, in fact, I was meeting with the Catholic bishops recently on this issue because the bishops do such good work on fighting modern slavery here in America, and the Catholic Church is doing work and programs around the world. And they were asking me, well, what is it that brought you to this? And I said, well, it really comes back to St. Thomas Aquinas and what we did in the 80s, what we did as far as justice issues, is what we did as far as the things that in many ways John Donaghy and others taught me how to think about. And having, I guess, opened with what my influences are and what my place is here in the Iowa State community, I think brings me to the fact that I'm thinking about women tonight, thinking about three in particular, women like my mother, Mary DeBaca, whose graduate work on the lives of rural women in Latin America, specifically in Argentina, was some of the first work that anybody had ever done to look at those theretofore ignored and voiceless women. Women like former Story County Attorney Mary Richards, who taught me that law and compassion could go together and continues to be the standard for the kind of attorney that I hope to be. But there's another woman, a woman who I never met, who I think about, a woman by the name of Imelda Ratua. She left the Philippines and her family with just a suitcase, knowing that she was giving up her job as a CPA, an accountant, to come to the United States to work as a domestic servant because her family needed the money. When I first saw Imelda Ratua in 1999, she was a body on a slab in a morgue. She'd been dumped like refuse on the side of the road as the couple who employed her tried to cover up what was frankly probably an inadvertent killing when she died after they'd beaten her. We investigated, and with the help of the New Jersey State Police, we established that she had been forced to be their maid and that she was beaten because she was behaving poorly in their minds. The state of New Jersey prosecuted the couple, but only won terribly short sentences, 4 years for the wife and 1 year for the husband. And the federal law, at that point, we did not have the tools that we needed to come in behind that and vindicate the rights of that woman and the rights of the United States to ensure that we lived in a society that was free from slavery. So those people basically walked away with sentences that mocked justice and mocked the woman who they'd killed. When we were investigating the case, I traveled to the Philippines for a conference of countries around the world that were working on human trafficking, and I took the time to go out with an FBI agent and a agent from the National Bureau of Investigation to try to investigate more about this case. And I met Imelda Ratua's parents. A very small, very old, and very distinguished couple. They traveled 4 hours to Manila to come and see me, solely on the strength of a phone call from the National Police saying, an American official's here and wants to talk to you about your daughter. They were honored that the U.S. would send someone all the way around the world to recognize that their daughter had been alive. And they brought pictures of her graduation. They brought their keepsakes. They brought her CPA license because they wanted to show me. They wanted to show America, this important official, something about themselves and something about their daughter. Their honor was my shame. I tried to square that autopsy photo with the hopeful graduate and the pictures that they brought with them. And I try to reconcile the gratitude that that family had for the United States with our inability to have known about their daughter and to have helped her before it was too late. But I can't. And I shouldn't. We should not try to reconcile the unreconcilable because some things should not be brushed away or made more comfortable. There are between 12 and 27 million people held in slavery in the world today, more than any time in history. How do we deal with that? How do we reconcile that with our ideas of progress and justice? We can, but we have to do so by confronting that truth and fighting it. It can be demoralizing, it can be wearying, but it must be done. I think one of the things that's enabled me to work against modern slavery, despite these things that I hear from survivors, is their strength. It comes back to the fact that the survivors who don't have all of the legal terms, they don't have all of the diplomatic language that we use when we talk about this, they are able to articulate what it is that they have suffered. They don't know which international convention it was or which international law, what paragraph, what code of the country's labor laws might have been violated. They don't know what euphemism is in vogue to make us feel better and to soften the pain of the word slavery. They don't know whether the euphemism is human trafficking or bonded labor or child labor or servant. But what they do know, and what they can tell us in more eloquent words than we ever can, is that something wrong was done. We have to stand in testament to the wrong that was done to them. We have to tell the stories that belie the faraway places and equally distancing euphemisms, and force ourselves to face the unfinished work of our common humanity. There was a time when another global scourge, a time very recently, when another global scourge was ravaging the world, and nobody seemed to care. Nobody funded research or a response, and we treated this thing as though it existed only in small pockets in the far reaches of society, in the big cities or elsewhere. We ignored it because it happened to others, and its name reflected that. At the time they called it gay-related immune disease, or GRID. Then moms and dads, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters started dying, and our ability to trust our blood supply was threatened. And all of a sudden, this wasn't something that happened to others. The world decided that we could no longer turn away from AIDS, the renaming, and then the reacting. Well, slavery is our global blood supply. I can't get dressed in the morning, and neither can you. I can't drive to work, talk on the phone, and grab a candy bar without being touched by the taint of forced labor and compelled service, of slavery in the world. I can't speak in Bangkok or in Washington, D.C., or Ames without knowing that the reach of slavery, the impact of slavery, impacts what we're doing. We need to de-other this notion, de-other slavery and human trafficking. We need to conquer our fear of the world so we can use its strength against those who continue to prey on those people. And we need a collective global outcry, not just because it's the moral thing to do, though it is, not just because it's the legal thing to do, though it is, but because we cannot function as a society in a world with slavery. You cannot have rule of law when you have slavery. We cannot have democracy and slavery. In his speech to the Ghanaian Parliament this summer, President Obama singled out for praise a journalist and a police officer who had fought to expose and dismantle trafficking rings. As he said, these heroes were the first steps towards democracy in that part of Africa. We cannot protect our environment. If slaves are forced to cut down the Amazon to smelt our steel, kill gorillas to be able to get to the minerals that make our cell phones work, or pour mercury into our rivers to mine the gold for our jewelry. We cannot have food security around the world if communities who once managed land and grew food crops are abducted and forced into combat or into mining or other economic activities by gangs, militias, and even government armed forces. One cannot talk about agriculture now without taking slavery into account. And so we have to reassess our development work in a new way. The World Food Prize is something that means a lot to people in Iowa and means a lot to me. But Indians of the lowest class, the Dalit, or the untouchables, are laboring under abysmal conditions at rice mills in the red hills of Tamil Nadu in India. Much of the rice is processed into pre-cooked, parboiled rice for export throughout Asia. Those people are bonded to the landowners who run the rice mills and lease out lands for rice cultivation. Some of them are working off debts as low as $5 that were incurred by their grandparents. The company store is alive and well. Forever in debt, they cannot afford adequate food and medicine, and they are without the economic security for growing their own crops. And what is the crop that we're talking about? The very strain of rice that giants like Norman Borlaug developed in order to end hunger. As someone who worked on international agriculture issues here at Iowa State, and someone who comes from a family that worked on international issues here at Iowa State, I do not want to see either my work, my family's work, or Norman Borlaug's legacy tainted by the slaveholders that then take those goods and put them into our supply chain. In 2007, another example, the rulers of Burma began requiring that all Burmese farmers devote a portion to their land to the cultivation of psychic nut, which is the castor oil nut, in order to produce oil within 3 years. The cultivation of the nut came at the expense of land otherwise cultivated for food crops, and as a result, there is a growing refugee crisis with Burmese leaving for China, for Malaysia, and Thailand. And when they are there, they are enslaved in Malaysia by the very immigration officers who should be trying to protect them and offer them asylum. Let's not forget as well, when we talk about food security, that the Congo was exporting food before the search for precious metals like the tantalum in our cell phones imported violence into the eastern Congo. Now people are starving and rare plant and animal species are dying out. The destabilizing nature of trafficking persons is almost ironically most frequently reported in the developing world, but I could give you examples from every industrialized nation as well. The profit potential of enslaved people is as renewable as it is morally corrupt. The underworld that it feeds deprives our countries not only of collective character, but the tax revenue, economic growth, environmental safeguards, and the free and thriving human capital that drive each nation. And you don't have to take my word for it. A recent World Bank report recently concluded that slavery blocks economic growth and social development and creates poverty. So we have to be honest about what we're dealing with, modern slavery. And we have to be honest about what we're doing to combat it. Not enough. Then we can talk about the opportunity for forums like this to provide the change that we need so that that paradigm is stood on its head. We can talk about our demand for cheap labor and sexual services and how traffickers enslave others to meet that demand. Government leaders, hearing from people who have engaged on this issue, need to begin not only to address the structures that enable slavery to persist, but also to build new programs to combat it. Prevention, prosecution, and protection must be implemented with a scalable, victim-centered approach that marshals the collective heft of government in service of those fundamental freedoms. That means prosecutions and victim services, of course, but it also means tax, trade, and immigration and agricultural policies. Every government can contribute to the eradication of human trafficking. The question is whether we have the courage, imagination, and commitment to do so. Those images that I talked about of Imelda Ratua, they stay with me. They make me wonder whether if we'd had the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was passed in the last year of the Clinton administration, enforced by the Bush administration, and now in the Obama administration gives us tools to intensify this fight. If we'd had that law when she came to America, if we'd had the kind of task forces that were standing up across the country, would we have been able to save her? Or would we have gone around our lives secure in the assumption that there's no slavery in the world, there's no slavery in our neighborhoods, there's no slavery in America? Would we have just driven by that house where that was happening to her? How many others are there who don't know that there are people who would help, that the government is ready to assist with services and immigration programs and justice? I want to honor the memory of those people by ensuring that every country has the laws and systems in place to stem this incomprehensible scale of exploitation and abuse and slavery. And there's hope. Our global enforcement data tells us that countries are beginning to enact and enforce these laws. In the 2008 report that my office does, we reported a total of 63 convictions in the entire continent of Africa. That number increased to 90 in the next year. Several countries have succeeded in taking an aggressive law enforcement approach despite limited resources. So, for example, in the last year, tiny Burkina Faso reported 11 convictions of traffickers, and Togo reported 10. Two of the smallest countries in Africa making up almost a fourth of the prosecutions in the entire continent. It's because of political will. Surely law enforcement efforts alone will not solve this problem of human trafficking, but without a credible deterrent, without threat of serious punishment for those who enslave others, an anti-trafficking effort will fail. Protection. A number of African countries have also made substantial efforts to protect victims. So, for instance, in Ethiopia, we see joint police and non-governmental organization identification and referral units. They call them child protection units. They are in each of the police stations in Addis Ababa. They rescue and they refer street children to the unit in the central bus terminal. In 2008, they identified and helped 899 abused children, of whom 75% was girls. They reunited families. 720 children were reunited with their parents, and the rest were put into foster care and shelters. So we do see success, but there's much more to be done. In Mali, Niger, and Mauritania, members of the Tuareg minority groups remain the masters, holding people in traditional slavery, owning families that they have owned for up to 500 years. In South Asia, members of low castes are born into servitude, as I talked about earlier, as bonded laborers. In Greece, child trafficking victims are subjected to forced begging and are forced to engage in petty crimes. Roma children, gypsies, are a constant reminder in Western Europe that this is not simply a problem in the developing world. America's shelters for foreign victims and U.S. citizen victims alike continue to have more clients than they have beds, more needs than they have funding. Every country, every age, both genders, no one is immune. Social workers, investigators, researchers, NGOs, everyone needs to be educated about the role that parents play in these scenarios. For instance, researchers investigating child trafficking in the cocoa industry mistakenly thought that if the employer was a close relative of the child laborer, the child was less likely to be enslaved, when in fact, desperate parents were selling their children to relatives under the mistaken assumption that if they sold their child to someone in the family, they wouldn't be abused as much. In January 2008, a South African court dismissed a trafficking case after learning that the victim's parents had allowed the trafficker to take the children to Cape Town, where sexual exploitation then occurred. So this becomes a problem of what can a parent do with the child? Can the parent actually sell the child into slavery? We have to look at what we're doing to keep these prosecution numbers low, whether it's mistaken ideas about the role of the parents, whether it's mistaken ideas about victim protection and prosecutions being antithetical. Regardless of why, the what is shocking. Over the last 5 years, we've seen about 3,000 prosecutions of traffickers worldwide. Remember the 12 to 27 million? Now I know that statistically that's a very bad sample. If we got 12 and 27 million. 15 million is certainly not as precise as we'd like to be. But I think that whether it's 12 million or whether it's 27 million, even if it's just 1 million, it's a massive violation of international law. But if you look at 12 and 27 million, we're looking at maybe 0.01% of all potential trafficking cases being prosecuted. Not 1%, 0.01. And because so much attention has been paid to the very real horrors of sex slavery, prosecutions of trafficking for labor exploitation account for only 3.5% of all of the prosecutions. About 104 prosecutions globally for people held in bondage in labor. Last week, the United States convicted 6 people for labor trafficking offenses, thus equaling the total output of Southeast Asia and the Persian Gulf combined for the year 2008 as far as labor trafficking. Now, I'm saying all these figures not because I like math. I think that my transcript, if anyone has access to it, would probably show that that is not something that I have professionals for that in my life. But, these dismal numbers aren't just about corruption. They aren't just about the hidden nature of the crime. They're about the institutional failure that makes a lie out of the promise of international law, out of the promise of the United Nations protocol that is now entering into its 10th year in force. It's kind of like declaring that all men are equal and putting down your pen and going back to where you keep your slaves. Each of us have to do more to prevent, prosecute, and protect, and to demand that governments engage. But the responsibility does not end with government. Business leaders cannot, on the one hand, simultaneously tout corporate responsibility, fair trade, 100% organic, etc., and ignore the fact of slavery in their supply chain. And we know that slavery taints the raw materials of most of the consumer products that we buy. The United States Department of Labor, about a month ago, produced a list of 122 products produced with child or forced labor in 58 countries. Most of these appear on the international market, and they end up on our plates. Shrimp. Most of the shrimp that we eat in America comes from Thailand. According to the International Labor Organization and the Solidarity Center, a significant number of Burmese women, men, and children are subjected to forced labor in the Thai seafood industry, a $4 billion export market to the United States. I've seen the hidden camera footage of a child that couldn't have been more than 9, standing on top of a bucket so that she could reach the top of the table so she could sort the shrimp, packed in ice. Shrimp that was probably caught by men on boats that UN investigators have found 50% of the men that they interviewed who had escaped from those fishing boats had seen one of their fellow crew members murdered by the bosses. So this isn't a problem there, even though I'm telling you a story about southern Thailand. This is a problem here. I've eaten shrimp in the last week. I'm sure so many of the rest of us have as well. The Department of Labor list: cotton, chocolate, sugar, steel, precious metals, orange, beef, gold. You can actually just turn that on its head and go to the finished products. Clothes, electronics, foods, cars. I'll promise you that my slavery footprint makes my carbon footprint look pretty small. And unlike on the environmental side, unlike on climate change, we're not asking about our slavery footprint. We don't have a certification. We don't have a way to offset at this point, but we can get one if we all start working towards it. And so businesses can and must do more, and consumers can and must do more. And while the solutions may never be as timely or as absolute as we would perhaps like, these are solutions that will literally save lives. Governments and consumers must mainstream the expectation that the skills and economic heft that companies use to maximize their profit in globalization also be used to trace and clean up their supply chains all the way down to raw materials. So that free trade sticker, that 100% organic sticker, now is the time to redefine it. I was working on Capitol Hill when the post-fill raid happened. And we immediately, at the request of Bruce Braley and others, scheduled hearings. But one of the things that was interesting in talking to the Rabbinical Union was that they said, as the certifying body for what is and isn't kosher, they said we can no longer say that anything made in that plant was kosher, even though the line was set up with kosher principles, with rabbis at the right places, with the kill floor was under the kosher requirements. And they said the reason that we could no longer certify that is because of the child labor, because of the forced labor in that plant. It's irreparably tainted. You cannot make good from bad. We need the rest of the corporations. We need the rest of the supply chains to think about this the way that the Rabbinical Union thought about what is treif. It's not just something on a list that comes to us through the centuries. It's how tainted was all of that meat based on what was happening in that factory. We have to not forget that the credibility that we bring to this issue is actually borrowed. It's borrowed from the people who suffer. It's borrowed from the victims that we serve. People who have paid too high a price for their freedom to have us negotiated away for anything less than the meaningful and transparent audits that reach deep into these global supply chains. And non-governmental organizations, even those who aren't specialized on slavery issues, have a role to play. The clean water they bring, the houses they build, the loans they make, the land they save, all of these are pathways to freedom. I met a young woman recently who was doing reforestation projects in southern Nicaragua. And she was seen by many as a hero because of what she's doing on global warming issues. And she came to us and she said, how can I, who is offsetting people's carbon footprint by planting trees, by trying to reclaim the rainforest, I see them moving girls from Costa Rica through to get them to Managua. They come through where we're trying to plant the trees. How can I help? But at the same time, how can I keep my people safe so that the traffickers don't retaliate against them? And we thought about it and we thought about it, and at the end of the day, what we came up with is the best way she can help is not necessarily by turning into a neighborhood watch on her part of the border. How she can help is by making linkages with those shelters in Managua, so that when women are liberated, when little girls are taken out of those brothels, when men are taken out of the plantations, they could actually get jobs with her, planting trees, offsetting climate change, offsetting other people's global carbon footprint. And I think that that's actually where we need to go. Even the environmental movement is a place where options can start to happen so people don't put themselves into that situation where the people exploit them so easily. I could spend a lot longer than we have tonight regaling you with stories about people like our friend in the environmental movement who's coming to this, or brave victims who have stood up to their traffickers. I will share one war story with you, and that's the case that was mentioned earlier, the case with the Vietnamese and Chinese who were enslaved in American Samoa. In a scene that almost was verbatim out of a movie that none of them had never seen, a young woman sat on top of her sewing machine and refused to work because the boss had not paid them. She didn't say union now because she didn't know how to say that. She didn't know that that was a concept that she could have in America because she didn't come from a place where she would be allowed to be in a union. But she was stubborn. And so when that factory owner had the guards beat her to the degree that she lost her eye, it was because he wanted to take her out. The end of the movie Norma Jean ends in a very different way. But fast forward 10 years. This summer I was actually able to see that young woman, Tran Thi Quan, and the other survivors from that case as they gathered for a 10th anniversary celebration in Houston. They live in the United States now. Their families have come from Vietnam to live with them. And they didn't want to celebrate the 10th anniversary of them being liberated, which would be another 2 years off. They wanted to celebrate the 10th anniversary of them first coming to America, first falling into this guy's clutches and being kept in this concentration camp style garment factory. And when I asked them, well, why would you celebrate that? They said, without that, we never would have found our strength. That is who we are now. It's that type of strength, the strength that she had to stand up for her friends, the strength that she had to look him in the eye from the witness stand, and the strength that they all now go on with. Business owners, their children are Americans. Amazing things are going to happen with that group of people. And meanwhile, the man that did that to him is going to die in federal prison. So there are successes that we can have, and there are people who we can think about as far as the strength. Before that type of strength, we all seem small. I think it makes us all think, what would I do? Would I be the one who would try to cut a deal to go work for this guy in the office and rat out my friends? Or would I be the one who stood up and took the beating and led the revolt that basically created the impetus for the FBI and others to come in and shut down the factory? None of us are going to probably have to deal with that existential question of what would I do in that situation, but we can all deal with the question of what are we going to do now. I opened by talking about a number of women whose examples inspire and drive me. And all of us, I think, men, women alike, can not just be inspired, we can actually be the inspiration. A world without slavery, a world without involuntary servitude sounds like an audacious hope. But when the framers of the 13th Amendment, on the eve of a war that ripped this country in two, made it illegal to own another person. They didn't just say, it ends today and we'll never think about it again. That's the first half of the 13th Amendment. It says slavery shall not exist, but it also says involuntary servitude shall not exist. So that's a promise. As my mentor John Conyers says, it is a promise written in the blood of all those who suffered in those 300 years under bondage, that we have to have a country that is free from slavery. Like I said, it's an audacious hope. Making it illegal is audacious. So is ensuring that women could vote. But so too was establishing a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to one very simple principle, that all are entitled to freedom and all are entitled to equality. Thank you.